Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we uncover powerful tales of humanity, resilience, and the unexpected kindness that restores our faith in the world. Today, we bring you an unforgettable story of Eleanor Davis, a 72-year-old woman who faced shocking cruelty in a Chicago cafe, only to find an unexpected champion in Hollywood actor Chris Evans. Stay with us to witness how one act of courage can spark change and inspire us all. On a crisp spring morning in Chicago, Eleanor Davis, a dignified 72-year-old woman, walked down the bustling streets of the city. Her slender frame was wrapped in a well-worn coat that had seen many winters, and her small handbag dangled from her arm. Eleanor had lived through countless challenges in her life, from the racial segregation of her youth to the quiet, daily battles of growing older in a world that often overlooked her. But that morning, as the wind carried the scent of fresh blossoms mixed with the city's industrial grit, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope for the day ahead. Eleanor's steps were measured, each one careful against the uneven pavement. She was mindful of her arthritis, which flared in the cold, and her Addison's disease, which required strict medication schedules. Her watch, a modest yet reliable piece she had owned for decades, told her it was nearing 12:45 p.m. She needed to take her medication soon, and the thought of sitting down somewhere warm was appealing. As she turned a corner, her eyes were drawn to a sleek new cafe nestled between high-rise buildings. The modern glass facade gleamed in the sunlight, and vibrant floral arrangements framed the entrance. A large banner proclaimed the cafe's grand opening, and Eleanor paused for a moment, contemplating whether to step inside. She didn't frequent such upscale places often. Her modest pension didn't allow for such luxuries, but the cold wind biting at her cheeks convinced her otherwise. Eleanor pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into the cafe. The interior was pristine, its clean lines and muted earth tones giving an air of understated elegance. The scent of freshly ground coffee and pastries wafted through the room, accompanied by the soft hum of jazz playing from hidden speakers. Professionals in sharp suits occupied many of the tables, their conversations hushed and their laptops open. She chose a booth near the back, away from the busiest area, and settled into the plush leather seat. As she shrugged off her coat, she allowed herself a moment to relax. The warm atmosphere was a welcome reprieve from the chill outside. A young waitress with a cheerful smile approached her. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink?" Eleanor returned the smile, her voice warm and polite. "Yes, dear. A cup of hot water, please, and perhaps a fruit tart, something light." The waitress nodded eagerly. "We have mixed berry tarts. Would you like one of those?" "That sounds lovely," Eleanor replied, pulling out her small pill bottle and setting it on the table. She had her routine down to a science. Check her appearance, touch up her lipstick, and take her medication with a sip of water. It was a ritual that brought her a sense of normalcy and control in a life often dictated by the constraints of her condition. As she glanced at her watch, she felt a sense of accomplishment for staying on schedule. But just as she began to relax, a shadow loomed over her. She looked up to see a man in his mid-40s, tall and lean, with sharp features and a cold, calculating gaze. His crisp white shirt and dark tie identified him as part of the cafe staff, but his expression betrayed no warmth. "Can I help you?" Eleanor asked, her voice calm despite the unease creeping into her chest. The man's lips curled into a sneer. "I think the real question is, what are you doing here?" Eleanor blinked, taken aback. "I'm just having a snack. I placed my order with the waitress." His eyes swept over her, from her modest sweater to her weathered hands. "We don't accommodate special requests here," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "That's fine," Eleanor replied politely. "I'll just take the tart and hot water." But instead of relenting, the man barked a harsh laugh. "A tart? In those clothes? With that skin? You've got to be kidding me." Eleanor felt the sting of his words, but she straightened her posture, drawing on decades of resilience. "Sir, I'm a paying customer. I'd like to speak with the manager." The man tapped the name tag on his chest with mockery. "James Thompson, manager and owner." At your service. Eleanor took a steadying breath. Mr. Thompson, I assure you I have as much right to be here as anyone else. I'm simply here to take my medication and enjoy a snack. There's no need for this hostility. His sneer widened. Your kind doesn't belong here. You'll scare off the real customers. This isn't a soup kitchen. The words cut deep, but Eleanor refused to let him see her falter. My kind, she repeated, her voice low but firm. Mr. Thompson, your prejudice says more about you than it does about me. But before she could say more, Thompson's actions escalated. He intercepted the waitress as she returned with Eleanor's order, snatching the tray from her hands. In a single motion, he flung the contents onto Eleanor. The hot water splashed across her arms and face, and the tarts smeared against her sweater, leaving angry red marks on her skin and a trail of sticky berry filling. Gasps rippled through the cafe as Eleanor cried out in pain. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Thompson said, his voice oozing false concern. "Your appearance must have distracted me." Eleanor's arms throbbed as tears welled in her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "I need ice or a medical kit." Thompson leaned closer, his voice low and cruel. "Dramatic, aren't we? Clean yourself up in the restroom." Shaking and humiliated, Eleanor gathered her belongings, her ruined pill bottle clutched tightly in her hand. She made her way to the restroom, leaving behind a trail of water and berry filling. Inside, she leaned against the sink, her reflection in the mirror a stark contrast to the strength she had tried to project. As she stared at the smeared makeup and angry burns on her skin, Eleanor whispered to herself, "You've faced worse. You'll face this, too." But even as she resolved to endure, the pain of this encounter lingered, not just the physical pain, but the deep, familiar ache of being treated as less than human. As Eleanor Davis stood in the cafe restroom, her trembling hands attempting to clean the sticky berry stains from her sweater and soothe the burns on her arms, she couldn't shake the wave of emotions flooding her. She had endured discrimination before, but there was something about James Thompson's venomous hostility that cut deeper than usual. Perhaps it was the utter lack of humanity in his eyes or the humiliating spectacle he had made of her in front of the entire cafe. Eleanor knew she couldn't stay in that restroom forever. The cold air from the aggressive air conditioning chilled her damp clothes, and she was dangerously overdue for her medication. Mustering her courage, she squared her shoulders, adjusted her sweater as best she could, and stepped back out into the cafe. The atmosphere hadn't changed much. Patrons were still hunched over laptops or engaged in hushed conversations, but their eyes flicked toward Eleanor with an uncomfortable mix of pity and avoidance. Her original booth had been taken by a pair of sharply dressed businesspeople, their oblivious laughter filling the air. She spotted an empty booth in a far corner and made her way there, feeling every pair of eyes on her as she moved. Eleanor was settling into the booth, still trying to calm her racing heart, when Thompson appeared again, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Still here," he hissed, leaning over the table. "I thought I made myself clear. You're not welcome." "Mr. Thompson," Eleanor replied firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "I'm a paying customer. I have as much right to be here as anyone else." "Your money isn't good enough for this establishment," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "People like you drive away the kind of clientele we're looking for." Before Eleanor could respond, Thompson snapped his fingers, summoning two large servers from across the room. "Escort this woman out," he ordered, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone in the cafe. The servers hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances, but with another sharp bark from Thompson, they moved toward Eleanor. "Please, ma'am," one of them said softly. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Eleanor's heart pounded as they reached for her arms. She tried to stand, but her foot caught on the table leg, and she stumbled. Time seemed to slow as she fell forward, hitting the polished floor with a painful thud. Her purse spilled open, the ruined contents of her pill bottle scattering across the tiles. The cafe fell into an oppressive silence. Eleanor lay on the floor, struggling to catch her breath, her body aching from the impact, She could feel the sting of tears threatening to spill, but refused to let them fall. As she reached for her scattered belongings, the sound of deliberate footsteps broke the silence. "That's quite enough," a calm but commanding voice said, cutting through the tension like a knife. All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. Walking toward Eleanor was none other than Chris Evans, the Hollywood star, his face set in a grim expression of disapproval. The room seemed to shift as his presence filled the space, the air buzzing with whispers and the quiet click of phones capturing the scene. Chris knelt beside Eleanor, his gaze gentle as he extended a hand to help her up. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Eleanor blinked in surprise, momentarily too stunned to speak. With his help, she got to her feet, wincing slightly as she steadied herself. "I'm fine," she murmured, though the pain in her arms and her chest told a different story. Chris turned to Thompson, his blue eyes hardening. "What exactly is going on here?" "This is my cafe," Thompson began, his tone oozing false politeness. "And I have the right to refuse service to anyone." Chris raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but sharp. "Refusing service is one thing. Humiliating, assaulting, and throwing a paying customer onto the floor is something else entirely." Thompson sputtered, trying to regain his composure. "This woman, she was causing a disturbance. My other customers." Chris cut him off, his voice icy. "The only disturbance here is your blatant lack of humanity. I've seen everything, and I'm pretty sure the law doesn't side with your actions." Turning back to Eleanor, Chris placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's get you out of here," he said gently. As they made their way toward the door, the murmurs in the cafe grew louder. Phones were now openly recording, and a few patrons clapped softly, though most looked on in stunned silence. Outside, the cool spring rain had started to fall, a light mist settling over the city. Chris guided Eleanor to a sheltered spot under the cafe's awning. "Wait here a moment," he said, his voice kind. He jogged over to a nearby kiosk, returning minutes later with a steaming cup of tea, pressing into Eleanor's trembling hands. He said, "This should help take the chill off." Eleanor stared at him, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger, this famous man who had stepped into her life at the exact moment she needed an ally. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Chris's expression turned serious. "What happened in there, it wasn't right. People need to know about behavior like that." He paused, studying her face. "Would you be okay if I did something about it?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "If it means no one else has to go through that, then yes." Chris's jaw tightened in determination. Pulling out his phone, he began a live stream, positioning himself so the cafe's name was visible in the background. "Hey, everyone," he began, his voice clear and controlled. "I'm outside Thompson's Cafe in Chicago, and I just witnessed something deeply disturbing." As Chris described the events in detail, Eleanor watched in awe as the world seemed to respond in real time. People on the street slowed to see what was happening. A crowd began to gather, their phones held high as they recorded and streamed the moment. Chris kept the focus on Eleanor's experience, emphasizing the cruelty she had faced and calling for accountability. The tension that had filled her chest inside the cafe began to ease, replaced by a sense of validation. For the first time that day, Eleanor felt truly seen. As the rain drizzled softly over the bustling Chicago streets, Eleanor Davis and Chris Evans stood under the cafe's awning, the tension of the earlier events still hanging in the air. The crowd outside had grown larger, with onlookers murmuring, phones capturing the moment, and whispers of disbelief about what had transpired. Chris ended his live stream with a firm call for accountability, his voice steady as he spoke about the need for compassion and justice. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the steaming cup of tea Chris had given her, its warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. She glanced at him, a mix of gratitude and disbelief in her eyes. "Mr. Evans," she began softly, "I don't know how to thank you. You didn't have to get involved, but you did." "Why?" Chris turned to her, his expression sincere. "Because it was the right thing to do. No one should have to endure what you went through today. Eleanor. His use of her name felt personal, as though he had made it a point to remember her as more than just a victim in a moment of injustice. Too often, people look away when they see something wrong. I've seen it happen before, and I've made a promise to myself not to be one of those people. Eleanor nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line to hold back the surge of emotion welling up inside her. The kindness she had just witnessed stood in stark contrast to the cruelty she had endured minutes earlier. As the rain began to intensify, Chris's security team arrived, their presence commanding and purposeful. "We'll make sure you're safe," Chris assured her. "Let's get you out of here." The sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and Chris opened the door for Eleanor, shielding her from the rain as she climbed inside. The leather seats were warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, hostile environment she had just escaped. Chris slid in beside her, his expression thoughtful and serious. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows filled the silence. Then Chris broke it. "Eleanor, would you mind telling me about what happened before I stepped in? I need to understand everything so I can make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Eleanor hesitated but then took a deep breath. She recounted the events from the moment she entered the cafe, her voice steady despite the tremor of residual pain and humiliation. Chris listened intently, his brow furrowing with each cruel detail. When she finished, she reached into her handbag and pulled out the ruined pill bottle. The label smeared and the contents turned to mush. "These pills," she explained, holding them up, "are for Addison's disease. They're not just medication, they're my lifeline. I budget carefully every month to afford them. When that man spilled water on me, he didn't just ruin my clothes. He jeopardized my health and wasted money I can't easily replace." Chris took the bottle from her, examining it with a serious expression. "I've heard of Addison's disease," he said, "but I didn't realize how critical the timing of the medication is. Eleanor, I'm so sorry this happened to you." Without hesitation, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "Please," he said, as he began writing, "let me cover the cost of your medication and anything else you need. After everything you've been through today, the last thing you should worry about is money." Eleanor's eyes widened as she saw the amount he had written. "Mr. Evans," she protested, her voice shaking, "this is far too much. I couldn't possibly accept it." Chris smiled gently, pulling the check out to her. "I insist. Think of it as a small gesture to help make up for what you've endured. Use what you need for your medication. And if there's anything left over, maybe treat yourself to something special. You deserve it." Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes as she accepted the check, her hands trembling. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Chris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to say anything. Just take care of yourself, Eleanor." When the car pulled up to her modest apartment building, Eleanor hesitated for a moment, glancing at the peeling paint and cracked steps. She felt a pang of embarrassment at the thought of Chris seeing where she lived. But he surprised her by looking at the building with genuine curiosity. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "places like this have a lot of character. They've seen stories, families, lives. There's something special about that." Eleanor smiled despite herself. "If these walls could talk," she said, chuckling softly, "they'd have plenty to say." As they stepped out of the car, Eleanor's teenage grandson, Jacob, appeared at the entrance, his lanky frame pacing with impatience. He looked up, and his jaw dropped as he recognized the man accompanying his grandmother. "Gran," he exclaimed, his voice cracking. Are you with Chris Evans?" Chris raised a hand in a friendly wave, and Jacob froze in disbelief. Eleanor couldn't help but laugh at his stunned expression. "It's a long story, Jacob," she said warmly. "Let's get inside, and I'll tell you everything." Inside their modest apartment, Eleanor sank into her favorite chair, while Jacob perched on the edge of the couch. Bursting with curiosity, "Gran," he asked, "how did you meet Chris Evans? Did he give you anything? Money? A signed Captain America's shield?" Eleanor shook her head with a gentle smile. "Jacob, Today was about far more than that. Chris showed me, and hopefully the world, that kindness and humanity still exist. What happened wasn't just about me. It was about teaching others the importance of standing up for what's right. As the rain pattered against the windows, Eleanor recounted the day's events to Jacob, emphasizing the lessons she had learned. She spoke of resilience, empathy, and the importance of treating others with dignity, no matter the circumstances. Jacob listened intently, his youthful energy tempered by the weight of his grandmother's words. By the time the story ended, he looked at her with a newfound respect. "Gran," he said softly, "you're amazing, and so is Mr. Evans. You both taught me a lot today." Eleanor smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. Life will always have its challenges, Jacob, but sometimes, in the midst of those challenges, you find moments of grace and humanity that make it all worthwhile. As the evening settled over Chicago, Eleanor prepared for bed, the weight of the day finally lifting from her shoulders. She tucked the checks safely into a drawer, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Tomorrow, she would face her challenges anew. But tonight, she was grateful for the kindness of a stranger and the reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could always be found. Thank you for joining us today on Empathy Stories. Eleanor's journey reminds us that even in moments of pain and injustice, the power of kindness and empathy can shine through. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Together, let's spread compassion and hope, one story at a time. See you next time.